All right, welcome to another tutorial. This one's going to be on the form field, and it's going to be a pretty natural extension of the previous tutorial, which was on styling of text form fields and text fields. This one's going to be much more about using them. We are going to review a little bit of what happened in the last tutorial first, and then we're going to go over a view model, an email field, password fields, and a custom form field, and then focus nodes. And the custom form field is really the core of this tutorial. This is going to be where we make our own widget that's a lot like a text form field that has validation and an error state and a way to modify the data. But it's going to be our own widget, and it's going to be this date picker here. It's going to be the birth date. So this project, it's going to be like a sign-up form. You have to put an email, it's a valid email format, a password. You have to make the confirm password the same as the other password, and there's toggle visibilities there, and then a birthday picker. Okay, so first let's just review text form field just a little bit with the password form field here. So this is my own widget here, and in it has a text form field. So a couple things that we're going to be using a lot here are the decoration with the label text. The label text is this guy here. Helper text makes it not grow in size if there's an error, because the helper text is where the error text goes. So if there's an empty string there's a little bit of padding here. And then the suffix icon is, of course, this guy here for the toggle visibility. But now in this tutorial, pretty much the last ones were not hooked up whatsoever. These ones are going to be hooked up with an onChanged validator, an actual value that we're going to manipulate. And then also when you submit it, we're going to give a little UX improvement here where you can go to the next text field. And it's going to change the focus automatically for the user. Okay. So first, what we're going to go over is a view model. And we're going to go over the concept of a view model a bit too. And here is a little article. It's a very short read. I'll link it in the description about MVVM. And the idea is that there is logic in your presentation layer. That logic being things like, how does this field validate? How do I build this string? Based on the state of my UI, what icons and colors am I supposed to be using? And that logic can actually be relatively complex, and complex enough that it's worth unit testing and it's worth encapsulating in a class. And that class that we're going to use is a view model which hosts all of the data that our form is going to have. And our view is going to have very, very, very straightforward things that come from the view model in order to present itself. And the business logic and data is not going to be part of this tutorial. So imagine the actual flow. The view model would have the logic for building this form, and then it would send it over processed data to something like a block or a Redux store or something like that to actually be sent in the API. So the view model is going to be a core part of this. So let's look at our view model. So we've got a user sign up view model. The first thing that we got to think of, pop the emulator back up here, is what data do we need to sign up our user? And I've just arbitrarily decided what we need is an email, password confirmation, and birth date. Now this is an interesting one because the actual data that you'd send to your server probably wouldn't have this confirmation with it, but remember this is the data that our UI needs, and our UI does manipulate a password confirmation to ensure that it's the same, that affects the validity of the form. So we need to add that in there. And I like to make all of these final, and we can also make this immutable as well, just to ensure that we're mutating it in known ways. And the way that we're going to mutate it, like in my other tutorials, is with a copy with pattern. So the first thing that I got here is a factory constructor for the new user, where everything is just null. This just hides a bit of boilerplate, and also in your code, it makes it a lot more readable. Like if you just see user sign up view model null, 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 and there's 20 nulls, you're like, well, what does this really mean? Or maybe some of them aren't null. In other places in your code, if you have a factory constructor for something like this, you're going to know what's going to go on. It's going to be a lot more readable. You say, oh, well, this is obviously a new user. We named it really well. Then there's just some simple logic here. These booleans just check each individual validator. Validators return a string with an error message if they are not valid. So if they are valid, it's null. And then we can look at each one of the validators as well. And it is valid. It's just the combination of all of those, of course. So in the previous tutorial, we wrote some string extensions, and I got them still kicking around here. And they have some handy methods for checking whether an email is valid via regex, if it's just white space, and there's an additional one which is valid password. Now you might want to also check if their password is strong or weak and give them a suggestion based on that, but this one is very straightforward. It just says it has to be at least 10 characters. Okay, so the email validator, we just make sure that it's there, and then we also make sure that it's a valid email. So you can give a better error message for your user depending on what they've actually entered in. So if they've entered in nothing, we could say something more specific than invalid email address. We can say it's required. We're going to do that for all of them. So go down to here to password confirmation. Maybe let's look at password first. So first off, we make sure it's not all white space, because then it's required field. And the other one is we just make sure that it's long enough, so the valid password being 10 characters. Similarly, the confirmation, first it's required. Second, it must match the actual password that you've already typed in, which is the one that this field manipulates. And the birth date validator, here's a good place to put some sort of logic. If your app had an age limit, like 12 or 18 years old or something like that, you could check here and make sure that they're old enough. So it's a required field as well. And then we just make sure that they didn't pick the current date or anything in the future. We just make sure that their birth date is actually in the past. Here you could also, this is where you would want to do that check, if they want to make sure they're of a certain age or something like that. Or maybe not too old, you don't want your user to be over 100 years old. That's probably unlikely. Just so you can guide them to make sure that they've selected the right thing. So to manipulate the view model, what we're going to do is copy with. So here's the 4 fields that it has, and they're all final. And if you want to manipulate one of them, instead of just directly assigning it, you use the copy with. So here we have the toString, and I've left a little comment here. So remember, if you're using something like passwords or any other sort of secure information, you really don't want to print that to console. You don't want to do anything with the passwords that you don't need to. So you don't want to save them in the preferences. You don't want to save them anywhere that's not super secure. And you want to get them even out of memory when you can. Just forget about them and make sure that you are not exposing that anywhere, because the console is going to be visible if somebody just plugs their phone in and looks at Logcat or something like that. So we're just going to, let's just make this something like that. So it might be useful to print the user email on the birthday and just know that there is a password or something like that. So we're not going to print the password. Okay, so next up, we've looked at the view model. Now let's look at the email field and how that's going to manipulate the view model and use it to give some logic of manipulating that field and having like an onChanged. So here we go to email form field. And also let's just look at the signup form too. So the signup form, we're going to have a couple things. We're going to have the form key and onChanged and the view model. So the signup form doesn't know anything about whether or not it's valid, because that logic is in the view model. So this one doesn't actually have a validator, but it does have the form key that the widgets are going to use to know when it's asking for them to be validated. So you press that submit button, they're going to know, oh, I'm not valid, so I got to show that message. OnChanged is required, not knowable. And then the view model, this is like the current value basically. We got some focus nodes to add the UX so we can pop from one to the other. And then we're going to build a form with a column with all of these different forms in here. So whenever you're using a field that can have a keyboard pop up, you want to make sure it's in a scrollable widget, or else when that keyboard pops up, you might get overflow issues. So this doesn't actually scroll. So the thing that consumes this, we need to remember to make it scroll, which I did in main. We don't need to look at that though. We're going to look at the email form field. So the email form field, we're going to use onChanged to manipulate that value. And onChanged for the individual field is just going to be the data that it cares about. So all this email field cares about is a string, and that's going to be hooked up to the string email from the view model. Next up, it's going to have a validator. I've made this widget a little more reusable in the sense that maybe you don't want a validator, so it's nullable, but we're going to pass one in. And then we have the current value, current email value that has been typed in. Adding a current value to these forms is actually really important. So imagine you rebuild the screen and there's already a bunch of values in there. You need to pass those values as the initial value into your form fields. This is really important, or else the value that the text form field thinks it is going to be different than the actual value in your view model. So you need to pass these initial values in, or else when your screen rebuilds, you could have some issues there. So we're going to pass that in, and then the focus nodes, the next one that it's going to go to, and the current one. And I like to put these outside and pass them in so that the thing that consumes this can control the logic of when these things are actually pressed and disposing of them as well. Okay, so they got the text form field here. When we submit the form, we're going to go to the next field. So when you hit here and we hit the check mark, we automatically go to the next field. I have the auto validate set such that it only validates when you hit submit. So that's why the error went away when I hit submit, because that's a valid email format. And the way that we know that's a valid email format is a validator that's passed in. So we go back to the sign up form. The validator is passed in from the view model. Great, because this is logic that your UI is using, so you want to put that in a view model. And pass that in there. And then the decoration, I've just hard-coded the decoration because I feel like this is perfectly fine for all email fields. We know it's going to be email. Here's an example. And then the helper text I always put as an empty string. So that on changed, let's look at the on changed that's passed in to the sign up from the sign up form. So on changed, what we're going to do is we're going to call widget.onChanged and with that view model and copy with that value. Because remember, this form also has an onChanged. So basically we're scoping it down. We're saying this guy has an onChanged where you change the entire view model, and then the individual form just knows about its own value, which is a string, that email. So we look at main here. At the sign up form, we in just state here we have a view model, and it's just the new user. And we're passing that in to the sign up form here. And then we are manipulating it with that copy with. And whenever we call that onChanged, what we're really doing is just calling a set state here. I think that for things like forms, just having a variable in your state and you're calling set state on it is appropriate, because this variable is really only scoped to this form. This isn't really like an app state sort of thing that you would need a whole block to control. Although you could if you really wanted to, but because no other screens are probably going to use this, I feel like using set state is sufficient here. So that's what's happening. So of course if we type AAA there, it's calling onChanged on every character and manipulating that view model over and over again. So the way that I've set it up here, you gotta remember that the view model has exactly what's typed in, and that's not necessarily a valid form, right? Because you can type whatever you want in here, and that's no longer a valid email because it has a space in there after the dot. So we'll just keep that in mind. Okay, let's go to the next part, which is the password fields. Password form field here, very similar. We've got an onChanged. This one's going to be nullable, just because it can be, I guess. We could make it required if we wanted it to be, and make it non-nullable. The validator that's going to get passed in by the view model. The label text, because it's actually different, password and confirm password. The current value from the view model as well, and then the nodes. So we go down, this one is stateful because it has that obscure password. Went over this in the previous tutorial, but this is a good way to, when you're using the visible password input type, and then you press this guy and it reveals the password there. So that's really useful when you have two passwords, because if you have a password that's valid and it's hidden, if you make a slight typo, it might look like you have the right thing and you're confused, and then you press this and you see, oh, there's an S in there, and my terrible password is all A's. I know they match. So just like the field before, we're going to request focus when this one is done. This is nullable here because eventually you get to where there's no more focus nodes and you've got to do the birth date. And the birth date doesn't actually have a focus node because it's got an on tap. You actually have to click it. So we're going to Boolean to obscure the text because it's a password field. Got to remember to pass that initial value in, and then the validator is onChanged. And we looked at how this stuff worked in the previous tutorial, so I'm going to skip over that. Okay, so there's a password form field. Next up, we're going to do the custom form field, and this is the date form field. And this is where I'm going to slow down and spend a lot more time, because this I feel like is really, really useful. So the use case for the widget that we're going to use, which is FormField, is that you have a form and they need to pick a certain type of data, and there's no built-in material Flutter TextFormField like thing. and you know that there's a valid submission or not a valid submission, and you want it to display some sort of error. What you're going to do is wrap the content that's going to manipulate that data with a form field, and you can give it this generic type if you want to. It makes it a little easier to program later with the type of data that it's going to manipulate. So the birth date field is going to be a date time. I've put this one to auto-validate on user interaction so that when they pick a date, the error message goes away. If it was required and they didn't pick one, got to pass in that initial value from the view model, and the validator comes to the view model as well, and so does the label. We have this 100 years here for the date picker. We'll look at that in a sec too. Okay, so what FormField allows you to do is have a validator and have a builder. And this builder works with form state. And form state is going to give us some access to some information like whether or not there's an error. And it's also going to allow us to maintain a value that this widget has to know, when it's changed, is it now valid? So this builder is required. It's got to return a widget, of course. And what I've got here is an input border of shape. So if you remember from the previous tutorial, we have our input decoration theme set up with the borders that we like for these fields. And you notice this one looks almost identical. And that's because it's looking up the input decoration theme of the text form field so that the styling is pretty much identical. So we can see that there's a Boolean for has error. We can build our border based on that has error flag. I think looking up your styles through the theme is a really, really good practice because it makes it really easy to make all of your widgets look identical, and it also makes it really easy to change things if you ever want your border radius or your colors to change. You can just change them once in your theme and have them propagate through your entire app instead of having to change a dozen or more different widgets that all have something hard-coded. So this widget is a column with a stack to make it look like a text field. So first let's just tap on it. Opens up a date picker. We pick a day. If we pick today, birth dates cannot be in the future. Pick a valid date. That title goes up here, and then we see the selected date right there. And that has a really, really similar feel to the existing fields that we have here. And I think that's great because it looks so fluid with the other ones, but it's actually our own widget. And that's in part because we're looking up the theme and using the values from there. So first let's look at the on tap. So here we have our list style. It's just a list style with a border, so we're passing it in that shape, which is really just a border. The icon isn't a button, it's just kind of a label. And the on tap, we await the show date picker, and if the date's not null, then we call on changed. So the date is going to be null if the user just hits cancel or taps away from the screen. So with our on changed here, we're calling the on changed from the widget that we're passing in, and this is what's going to manipulate our view model. But our form state also has its own state and its own variable which tracks the current value. So we need to call did change to make sure that that form knows that it's got a new value. If we forget to do this, your view model and this widget are going to get out of sync. So it's incredibly important to call both of these. If you're changing it from multiple different places, you might want to make your own onChange method within this class so you never forget to actually call that, because you always need to call both of these. So initial date is the date that's initially selected, and then the last date is the last date that's available to be selected. So both of those are today, so you can't pick a date in the future, but you can pick the current date, which doesn't really make any sense. And then the first date is the first date that's available to be picked. So if you go back over 100 years, which I do think it allows you to do here. Oh no, it doesn't. Oh, that's really nice. So you can't pick over 100 years because we've just told it that it's invalid. Cool. So this build list tile is up in a stack. And the reason it's in a stack is because this little text isn't really built into a list tile. So this is just some some custom code here for building this floating label. So after they picked a value, the value goes here just like the other fields, but then this guy is here and it's in the build floating label. So we can see the logic in our UI is dead simple because most of it is in the view model. So if there's no current value, if there is a current value, then we build this label right here. So let's look at build floating label. It's a positioned container with just some text, and it gives a really similar padding as the other ones. And just like the other border, we can look up the theme of this text through our input decoration theme. So if you ever change that font, it's going to change here too. Okay, so that's the floating label. And then here's the state part with the error as well. It's not going to inherently show us an error text. We got to choose where that's going because we're building this form widget from scratch. So here we're going to build our error text. If we, let's pick the current day again. That's this text right here, build error text. So it's really simple. If there is an error, we're just going to build this text. So we know that that error text is not going to be null. So we use that nullable operator and just build a text here with some similar padding as the other widgets. And similarly, we just look up the theme for that text there. So yeah, that's just about it for FormField. It's really quite simple to make your own form fields that behave a lot like a text form field. And I think it's a really good practice to do that because then the entire form can work with this form key and have that submit button be blocked via whether or not it's valid. Okay, so we've looked at the custom form field. Let's just take a quick look at the focus nodes and how those work. So on our user signup form, it's got the focus nodes here, and then focus nodes need to be disposed of in your dispose. So that means that they need to live in a stateful widget so they can have a dispose. These resources are not necessarily discarded just if your widget isn't on the tree because it's in a stateful widget. So we're going to pass those in to each of the fields. So they're going to have their current focus node and then the next one that it's supposed to go to. So when we hit enter, we're going to call that next focus and it goes to the password focus. Next one's confirmation. Oops, not submit, we have to hit enter. And then let's delete this. Whoop. And then there's no more focus nodes. So the way that I do it to make it just check nullable to only request focus when there is one is just use the question mark operator here so that it only calls it if there's one that exists. And I like to put it on a field submitted, which is when people hit the check mark. I feel like if they hit the down arrow, they don't actually want to go to the next field. They're explicitly closing the keyboard, like I don't want a keyboard. But if they're hitting a check mark, I feel like that's more like an action like, yeah, I'm happy with this field, I'm going to go to the next field. There's a bit of a subtle distinction, but I think these sort of things matter if you do them enough UX improvements. All of a sudden your app feels really, really easy to use. Okay, so the last thing that I think we should look at, we have the form and its use in main. And here's the part where we're actually pressing the submit button. And the submit button is a floating action button. It could be whatever, but the point is what you're going to do is use this form key.currentState. And current state is not going to be null as long as it's actually used, so it's safe to do this. And then we're going to call validate. And validate is going to tell every single form widget underneath this scope to validate itself. And if it's not valid, it's going to show it's an error automatically. And then it's going to, based on that, tell us whether the entire form is valid. So one thing to note is that if you somehow screwed up your UI, it might disagree with whether or not the entire view model is valid. So I put an assertion here just to check to make sure, and make sure that the widgets agree on the validity that the view model says. Because remember, the widgets are each looking at each field individually, and the view model is looking at all of the fields together. So you'd hope that they would be the same, but it's good to check. And I think this is worth an assertion just in case you delete a field like, oh, we don't want them to confirm our password anymore. Well, if you delete that widget, the view model is now going to think it's invalid no matter what, which could screw some things up. So I think this is good because it could also break some unit tests if somebody accidentally deleted a field. And then you would know that things have actually been broken from that deletion. And here is where you would do something with the actual logic. So going back to the MVVM, and this is also applicable to like blocks and Redux and something like that. This is where this process data would go over here to our business logic. So this is where we would actually submit a new user to our server or something like that. And then this screen would then need to build itself based on that state to show that it's pending, and then, you know, if it succeeds or failed, do something with that new user. So yeah, hope you enjoyed it. That was our tutorial on the custom form field widget. So we did some more styling of the text form fields, looked at a view model and conceptually why it's a good idea to use a view model. Then looked at the email field, some password fields, and our custom form field, and then linked them all together with the focus nodes.